What a wonderful time Christmas is here at Buck Run. And it's a time when I often turn to a passage that I'm fixated on. I love the Gospel of Luke, but I really enjoy Matthew's account of the birth of Jesus. He does not focus so much on the birth. We don't have the no room in the inn and any of that. He focuses on what happens afterward. Pastor Adrian read us the end of Matthew chapter 1, where Mary gives birth to Jesus and called his name. But then Matthew picks up the story. This is not as often the Living Nativity scene show. First of all, it has three wise men coming, and they usually have them, for dramatic effect, they have the wise men coming the night of the birth. There's the star and all that. That's most assuredly not the way it was. The wise men, and first of all, we don't know how many there are. Well, the truth is we don't know who they are. They're magi is the word used, and they're from the east. Somehow they have come in contact with the Hebrew Scriptures, probably through when the Jews were exiled into Assyria, Babylon, Persia. These were probably some type of Zoroastrian priest, semi-royalty, and they studied sacred text, and they had access, no doubt, to the Old Testament Scriptures. I tend to think they had access to especially the books of Jeremiah and Daniel. Daniel, of course, would have been written in exile, and they would have known of this Hebrew who delivered prophecies even while he was in exile. And Daniel gives a timetable for the coming of the Messiah. As a matter of fact, beginning in January, we're going to do a study through the book of Daniel. And Daniel starts out simple enough. You have these beautiful, lovely stories about the three Hebrew children and then how they won't eat the king's food and they get thrown in a fiery furnace and Daniel's into the lion's den. You've got these nice narrative texts. And then you have all these visions, these apocalyptic visions that are going on. And sometimes it's hard to see how these things fit together. But frankly, the book of Daniel is God's story that reveals his glory. And I believe that perhaps these magi, they had access to this. They're looking for this Jewish Messiah. A timetable is given for his arrival in the book of Daniel. And then God sends them a sign. It's this mysterious star in the east. We really don't know what that is either. They see the rising of this star, and it causes them, between their apparent access to the Hebrew Scriptures and this astronomical sign that God specifically reveals to them as a fulfillment of this text, that this indeed has arrived. These magi leave the east. They come across that great Arabian desert, and they're in search of the one who is to come. And this is the story Matthew tells in Matthew chapter 2. I want to take 2 weeks on this. I think it's a great text, not only about Christmas, but about New Year's. We'll see the second half of it next week, but read with me beginning in verse 1 of Matthew 2. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men, magi from the east, came to Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet, and you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word, that I too may come and worship him." After listening to the king, they went on their way, and behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they fell down and worshiped him. Then, opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. And being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. Well, really, I think Matthew 1 and 2 are the microcosm of the whole story, not just of the gospel, but it's really a microcosm of the story of Israel. This is Matthew telling us how Jesus is the fulfillment of that. In fact, if you look at the Gospel of Matthew, you'll see that for Matthew, the most important word is king. It opens up in chapter 1, verse 1. You see that this is the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David. Who's David? David is the king. You read that genealogy, and it is dominated by the names of kings. David, Solomon, Rehoboam, Abijah, Asaph, Jehoshaphat, Josiah, Jeconiah. But alongside that list of names, there is a bitter and brutal history of the decline of a nation that could not be delivered by her kings, and ultimately, with Jeconiah, they're taken into captivity, and there they are scattered. And since that time, there really is no true king of the line of David. They're not really a nation. They're scattered, and they are ruled, and they are oppressed. Because ultimately, these kings could not come and save their people. Matthew tells us how is it announced when Jesus is announced. It says he will come to save his people from their sins in verse 21 of chapter 1. So Matthew is telling us who Jesus is. That most important word is king, and in the very first scene, really, that involves anything after the birth of Jesus, well, now you have the story, not of one, but of two kings. Because it's the story of Herod, the king, and Jesus, who at this point we only know as a baby. Now, I'm just going to ask your forgiveness and your indulgence at the beginning, because I've just got to talk about Herod. And I'm going to tell you for just a moment, forget the Bible. I know that sounds odd for me to say that, but while I'm at it, let me just say forget Josephus too. Because Herod's bad reputation comes from these two sources, the Bible and Josephus. It's not ill-deserved. He deserves all the bad reputation he gets. But I want you to understand that Herod is one of the most compelling figures in all of world history. In fact, if you just forget all the megalomaniacal murders and all that stuff, killing his wives and his kids and all that, put that aside for a moment. Just look at the land. Look at what he did. I mean, it's really remarkable. His father is appointed procurator in Judea by the Roman Empire. Herod is one of two brothers. He's the younger brother. He's not even the most talented brother. His older brother, Hershael, much more talented, better warrior, but has a better ruling temperament than Herod does. And Herod is stuck up in Galilee, and Hershael gets to rule alongside his father down in Judea. And the fact that Herod survives what his father and his brother do not. When one of the descendant kingdoms of Alexander the Great attacks Judea, They put Antipater to death. He's murdered. That's Herod's father. And then they capture Hershael, and rather than in any way to be turned, Hershael commits suicide, bashes his brains in while he is in custody of these people up in Syria. And Herod, man, he runs down to where he will later build a palace. He runs down and hides out at Masada. And when he's able to somehow repel this Seleucid attack, he makes his way to Rome, and he curries favor with Mark Antony, and he gets real cozy with Mark Antony and Cleopatra. But then when Mark Antony is defeated at the Battle of Actium, Herod makes a beeline for Mark Antony's victor. The guy that we know in the Bible is Caesar Augustus, and he convinces him, hey, if I was loyal to Mark Antony, I'll be even more loyal to you. And he leaves being appointed by the Roman Senate to be called King of the Jews. It really looked like he was going to be wiped out. He has survived so many things, and yet he is appointed by the Roman Senate King of Judea, King of the Jews. And then he begins really a 40-year building program that is unparalleled to this day. He builds somewhere between 10 and 15 palaces for himself, every one of which has a freshwater pool in the middle of it, even those that, like at Caesarea, jut out into the Mediterranean. In the middle of the saltwater sea, Herod has a freshwater pool. He builds Masada, Herodion, Machaerus. He has 3 winter palaces down at Jericho. He creates a city called Caesarea Maritima and gives Israel something they never had before, which is a port. He figures out how to pour concrete underwater and have it set so that there is a smooth surface, and he builds a breakwater so ships can now come in. And he gives Israel, makes them a major trading partner in the Middle East. Herod does all of this. But that nasty streak of paranoia just keeps rearing its ugly head. And he doesn't trust anybody. He kills his brother-in-law, who is the high priest. He kills his favorite wife, Miriam. He kills his own sons because they begin to look like they could one day rule. And he's threatened by them. He's so brutal to his own sons, even while he's practicing Judaism, that Caesar Augustus one day said, I'd rather be Herod's pig than his sons. And he builds the temple. Israel, who had no real center of worship, they had built that temple after the exile, but remember, the people wept because they didn't have the glory of the former. And man, Herod gives them a temple that is unlike anything else in the world. In fact, the architectural wonder of this temple is amazing. And just a few weeks ago, I and some others from here at Buck Run stood in those Western Wall tunnels, and we stood by this solid rock. It does not match the surrounding bedrock. It's 150 tons. It's this massive rock, and it's up on top of what we call the Temple Mount. We don't know how they got it there. We don't know how they shaped it to fit it into place. I mean, how do you carve a rock on the bottom to perfectly fit the face of the mountain in order to give it a level surface? And how do you get it up the hill? We don't know, but Herod did it. There's all kinds of architectural things that he did. We have no clue how he even knew to do it. You can understand how he gets to be a great warrior, lots of practice. But where does he get his architectural knowledge? And Herod uses all of this genius to keep himself in power in a world where he's having to deal with all these competing armies, and Israel is right there. It's that sacred bridge between north and south, east and west. It's the trade route between Arabia and Egypt, between Europe and Asia. And he's got to balance all of this. And he does so in a brutal way, just absolutely assassinating anyone who seems to bring a threat in his way. And these innocent magi don't know what they're getting into. Well, they would have come across the Arabian desert, and probably the place where they would have crossed the Jordan River would be there at Jericho. And the very first thing they would have seen in the land of Israel was all the balsam trees growing in Jericho. They would have seen the opulence of Herod's palace. They would have walked on the road that goes from Jericho up to Jerusalem, and they would have seen the aqueduct bringing water from the heights of Jerusalem down there to the desert of Jericho. They would have admired all that Herod did in order to build this incredible country that he has built. What they did not have any clue about is that when they showed up in Jerusalem, they asked the question that would have struck fear into Herod's heart like no other question. Where is he who's born King of the Jews? Oh, because no one claimed that title. Herod did not have that title. In fact, Herod's not even really a Jew. He's an Idumean. He's from the descendants of Esau. And he's converted to Judaism, but the Jews don't really count him as a true Jew. But as a descendant of Esau, there's no way he can lay claim to the throne. Rome appoints him king. But here these innocent magi from the east show up, and they are asking for the one who is born King of the Jews. Now there's clearly a messianic expectation that the Jews have, because Herod knows to call in the chief priests and the scribes and say, okay, where's that supposed to happen? It's telling he doesn't know his Bible well enough to answer the question himself. It's telling that he can't quote chapter and verse on this, but they know, and they say, oh, it's in the prophet Micah. The Messiah is going to be born in Bethlehem. Now notice the contrast that's going on here between these two kings, Herod and Jesus. One has ascended to palaces and a throne. One has descended from a throne to a womb. One lives in opulence, in multiple royal palaces, and one reclines in a manger. One is born into poverty, and one feels entitled to be rich. It's the story of two kings, but the minute we realize that Herod is a descendant of Esau, then we also know that this is the story of two brothers. See what Matthew is doing with this. Why is he bringing Herod the Great into the story? Why does the life of Jesus begin with a war made on him by this earthly king? Well, we'd have to go back to the story of Esau and Jacob. And you recall that when Isaac and Rebekah married, and Rebekah became pregnant, God said to her in Genesis 15, verse 23, he said, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other. The older shall serve the younger. And that was about the birth of Esau, the oldest, and Jacob. And you remember the story, how Esau sold his birthright, how Jacob deceived his father. You have this enmity between Esau and Jacob throughout their lives. Genesis chapter 36 is a list of the descendants of Esau. And if that list could continue down to the day of Jesus, Herod the Great, the son of Antipater, would be in there because he's a descendant of Esau. And Matthew begins with the genealogy of Jacob. Jesus is a descendant of Jacob and Judah through David, all the way down to the present time. So now it has come down to this. The birth of a descendant of Jacob is met with an attempt to kill him by a descendant of Esau. And the story of those two brothers and the struggle for who will dominate continues here in Matthew chapter 2. But more than that, it's a choice between two paths. Because these two kings represent two very, very different things, don't they? On the one hand, Herod represents self. It's all about self. Herod uses his genius not to help the poor, but to build as many as 15 palaces for himself. He puts his genius to work to enlarge his coffers. He is always scheming and striving to increase his power. And anyone that is a threat to his power, he will absolutely demolish them, even if they are those that are closest to him, his wife, his children. But on the other hand, you have a king that teaches us about sacrifice. That he comes not to take, not to put down, not to oppress. He comes to give life. He comes to cool a fevered brow. He comes to give hope to the hopeless, to give sight to the blind, to give freedom to the captive. He comes in the most unexpected ways. Chip Hutchison, writing for Kentucky Today, had an article this week in which he said this: there were so many posts about the president's trip to Dawson Springs. Today I saw someone even more notable. I saw Jesus. He was down by the Dairy Queen directing traffic. I also saw him over at the church taking a bag of donations out of his truck. Then he helped a forklift get unstuck from a ditch next to the FEMA tent. Jesus sure was busy today. I went down Industrial Park and saw him working hard clearing debris, and again on Nortonville Road, high up in a bucket, restoring power to a weary town. I took my auntie to the school to get her some food, and believe it or not, Jesus was there too, sorting the canned goods. No sooner did I step out of the school, I saw him again out back serving food from a pretty cool food truck. Down on Walnut Street, he was standing out in the rain trying to get people to stop and take water bottles. He is, after all, the living water. He had enough time to go over to Hosick Avenue to turn on the gas for a cold neighborhood. Somehow, he got to East Railroad and was putting a tarp on a damaged roof. I saw Jesus driving a backhoe over on Alexander. He even got down to Pennyroyal Park. I'm certain of it because I saw him tossing bags of clothes into the back of a big trailer to store until those affected by the tornado could find a place to live. Jesus left his mark everywhere he went. If you drive around town, you can see his footprints too, usually in the form of cases of water on most street corners and practically at every church. Jesus likes to leave evidence of his presence. It's interesting to note Jesus didn't come to town in a motorcade. No, he came in a tree-cutting truck, a police car, a National Guard Hummer, and even an Amish buggy. He also got around pretty well on a skid steer, a four-wheeler, a backhoe, a dump truck, and a tractor. It wasn't as fancy, but he got here. He wasn't wearing a suit and tie. Instead, he wore work boots, reflective vest, hard hats, and aprons. He changed quite a bit, though. I saw him once in a FEMA uniform, another time wearing the garb of the Red Cross. He got around a lot today. I noticed that the president's motorcade flew by so fast I didn't even get to see his face. But I saw the face of Jesus today. His feet walked the streets of Dawson Springs, touched the lives of so many people. He didn't fly by. He stopped and stayed a while. No one can convince me that Jesus isn't alive and well. I know it because I saw him for myself today in Dawson Springs, Kentucky. No president or king has time to spend in small cities all over the nation he governs. The point is we have a king who does come down and spend time with us. He's touched by our tragedies and infirmities. Aren't you glad? Oh, this is a choice between two paths. The king of this world representing self, and the king of God's kingdom representing sacrifice. But it's the story of two promises. Because the story that culminates here in Matthew chapter 2 begins all the way back in the book of Genesis. You know, the first promise God gave was a promise of death. He said in Genesis 2:17, "Of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in that day you eat of it, you shall surely die." That was God's promise to Adam and Eve, that if you disobey my word, and if you go your own way, if you choose to not have me rule over you, but to be your own governance, to be your own king, as it were, to have your own law, that is the way of death. And if you do that, you're free to do that, but you will surely die. And they did it. In spite of God's word, in spite of God's goodness that provided them everything they could possibly need, they ate of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And as soon as they ate it, their spirits died. They were dead in trespasses and sins. Their bodies began to die. This world became broken and fallen. It became a world of tragedy and bloodshed and tornadoes and hurricanes and earthquakes, and all kinds of forces were unleashed that we cannot control, because God's promise was a promise of death. But in his grace, after they sinned, he gave a promise of life. A second promise is given in Genesis 3:15. He says to the serpent, "I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel." Well, that's what we have. That's what we call the proto-evangelion. That's the first gospel. It's the first time we have a promise of a deliverer. It's the first time we have the promise of another king who will come, and he will rule in righteousness, and he will restore what sin has taken. And so ultimately, when we see these two kings in Matthew 2, it's the choice between two destinies. Herod, of course, represents the destiny of hell. You know, one of the places that I always go, every time I go to Israel, we went there this time, is Herodian. Herodian was one of the palaces that Herod built for himself. And Herod planned for his own funeral and his own entombment there at Herodian. And Josephus describes it in great detail in one of his books. And you can go there today, and Ehud Netzer, the great Israeli archaeologist, discovered his tomb there in 2009. And they're restoring it, and you can see the royal procession. And Josephus describes all that went with his this incredible funeral as they brought Herod's body and draped in the finest cloth and showered with so many crowns, and they entombed him there in the side of this great mountain that bore his name. But inwardly, spiritually, something else had happened. The Herod, known as the Great, Herod that wanted more and more and was threatened by any challenge to his power, found himself in a lake of fire where the worm dies not and the flame is not quenched, because that's where the fall leads. That's where sin leads. But Jesus, this other king, don't forget, why did he come? He came to save his people from their sins. Well, there's the great promise. There's the great act of grace, is that God sent his son Jesus not merely to show us how to alleviate suffering, not merely to teach us to be kind, not merely to show us that there's a way of sacrifice. No, Jesus did not come merely as an example of all those things. Jesus came as a sacrifice for sins, to atone for our sins and to satisfy the wrath of God, so that there's nothing between us and God, so that we can have heaven when we die. And you know, the history of the world for the last 2,000 years has been a history of those who pursued the flesh, and whatever they got in this world was as good as they ever got, because when they died without Christ. But there have been multitudes who may not have had anything in this world. They might have gathered with other believers in some jungle hut on the Serengeti. They might have gathered with some believers behind the Iron Curtain or in some communist regime. They might have gathered with other believers knowing that if they ever publicly professed their faith, they would be beheaded. And yet, though they had nothing in this world, they had heaven awaiting them whenever they died, however they died. That's the choice that we have today. It's a choice between two destinies. And you know, there's no third option. You really are either following the way of Herod, and it's about this world and all the power you can get, the influence you can get, and what you can accrue and attain, or it's about Jesus, who came to satisfy the will of the Father and to glorify him by saving his people from their sins. Now, these magi, they came curious, they came searching, they came wondering, where is he who's born King of the Jews? But when they found him, they only had one response, and that was to worship. That's the only response. What you choose will determine who you worship. And today, if you choose your own way, then you're going to worship the things of this world. Ultimately, you're worshiping yourself. But if you choose the way of Jesus, it's a way that leads through sacrifice. It's a way that leads to a cross. It's a way that leads through an empty tomb. But it's a way that leads to the right hand of the Father. And if you choose him, you will worship him.